the Germans, based on their experience, and they also know their own history, know that when Berlin and Moscow have cooperated and done business together, there has been peace in Europe. If there's any one war in human history that made absolutely no sense, it was the war between Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. They had been close allies and friends for hundreds of years. There was no reason for that to happen. It did. The Second World War, we know the background on that. It was a huge tragedy. Everyone decided in 1945, who was German, this will not happen again. We will not permit it. I cannot imagine Chancellor Kohl or Chancellor Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, that some of your viewers may remember, standing up and urging equipment be sent to this corrupt gangster regime in Kyiv that's killing off its own people with these stupid instructions that are given to their generals in the field, with a military structure that is corrupt, and celebrating it. On the contrary, I think they would have said absolutely not, out of the question. This man, Schultz, is not going to last long. And if anything, what we're seeing now, even though it is not patently obvious, is the beginning of the end of NATO.
So, Colonel, big picture, here's my head scratcher. If the West, if the leading countries economically in NATO, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France, want to wage this war against Russia, if Tony Blinken and his globalist buddies in the foreign ministries in Western Europe really think that they can use the war to push Putin out or weaken him, if Jack Devine and the CIA, or if Jack is actually articulating what the CIA is trying to accomplish, why is the Western military response so tepid? I mean, you can't fight the Russians with just a half dozen tanks, and you can't fight them at all with tanks that aren't going to get there for another 4 or 5 or 6 months. And American troops in Poland are not going to keep Putin up at night.
We have 100,000 troops in Europe, and of that number, I'd be surprised if we have 40 or 50,000 combat troops. That means the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains who actually go in and shoot people. In other words, most of that is still support. And we don't have that much artillery. We don't have that much in the way of immediate indirect fire support. We're in no position to do it. We could bring in more Poles. They can bring in a couple of 100,000 Poles to fight, but they're not going to be adequately armed to take on the Russians, and they're not going to be adequately trained. So it's sheer lunacy. But again, you've got to go back and understand how this began. At the beginning, Putin sent in a very small force and gave them very specific instructions that they were not to kill civilians, they were not to damage infrastructure, because he was simply trying to demonstrate the seriousness with which Russia viewed what we were doing in eastern Ukraine by building up this dangerous force against them. Well, it took 2-3 months. He finally figured out no one is going to negotiate with us. No one cares to. In the meantime, we reached the erroneous conclusion that, see, look, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't cope. The Russians are no threat. We can beat them. Well, that was the wrong conclusion. And what we're seeing happen right now is a massive expansion of Russian military power on a scale that we have not seen since the Cold War. And this is going to be a permanent expansion, a large and powerful force. The 700,000 plus that are around Ukraine right now are a brand new force, a brand new army. This thing is poised to do one thing: annihilate whatever is in its path. It will do that. However, again, the Russians are being methodical. They're being cautious because they do worry that we are led by impulsive, erratic personalities in Washington. And that stupidly, when we realize that the place is falling apart, I mean Ukraine, someone will say, well, we have to do something. I don't know how many times while I was on active duty, I heard people at the top of the political structure say, well, we have to do something. As soon as they say that,
right,
leave the room.
Right.
Get the hell out of there.
I mean, this is a favorite government line. They have to give the impression to the public that they're doing something, even if it's 180 degrees from what they're doing. But the West, whether it's Chancellor Scholz or President Biden, or to a lesser extent, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like a boxer punching with his left hand and then apologizing to the gallery with his right for hitting too hard. What are they accomplishing?
Schultz is doing what he's done throughout his career. Remember that Schultz and others have grown up over the last 30 or 40 years in this environment where there was very little change. And their formative period of experience came after the Cold War ended. And they saw a very different world. And they became, I think, enamored of this notion that the United States is the hegemon of the world, and that whatever we do is right, and anybody who resists us is morally wrong. They've taken this position, and this justifies all sorts of dangerous behavior. I don't think that Mr. Schultz is going to last much longer. I certainly don't think his foreign minister will. These people are out of touch with reality. No competent German statesman over the last 300 or 400 years would have made the stupid remarks and statements that they have.
Didn't he just lose his defense minister about 2 weeks ago?
Well, we haven't had much of it in the way of defense ministers in that country now for at least 20 years. I mean, when we went to Desert Storm in 1991, arguably the Germans had the finest forces in NATO. I mean, they were top notch, and they remained excellent through the mid 1990s. And then a series of leftist governments systematically dismantled them. This is after Chancellor Kohl left. Now, on the one hand, they took the position that Russia was not a threat, and it is not a military threat to them unless they make it so. And that was understandable, but they lost sight of the fact that if you have no skin in the game, as I said earlier, when it comes to military power, nobody's going to pay attention to you. I mean, the Polish army could invade Germany tomorrow morning and conquer it in a week.
Ooh, well, that's the line of this of this interview. Colonel, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. By the way, can I add one thing that a lot of our people don't seem to understand about these tanks?
Please.
We promised 31 M1 series tanks. They have to be built from scratch. And people have said, well, why is that? Well, it's very simple. We have a form of armor protection on the existing M1 series tanks that is some of the very best in the world, if not the best. That was developed over many years. It's a very complex composite form of armor. We will not allow tanks with that unique armor to fall into the hands of the Russians. And we have to assume, based upon the Ukrainians that have lost, we estimate 7,000 vehicles, including at least a couple of thousand tanks and 2,000 or 3,000 other armored vehicles that have either been destroyed or fell into the hands of the Russians. We have to assume that these could. So the decision was made to build 31 M1 series tanks, but apply the 1970s armor to them. So that if they fell into the hands of the opponent, it would not be a security risk for us. We would not lose this advantage that we have. But there's something larger here, and this is very important. There's a lot of nonsense going on about what we're going to send. And you've heard all the analysts that are worth a damn and honest point out it's not going to make any difference. I think we're preparing an apology in advance. I think everybody in Washington in a few months is going to say, well, we did all we could. Look at all that we sent. We just couldn't make it happen. And I think that's where we're headed. In the meantime, millions of Ukrainians' lives are destroyed. The state is destroyed. The nation is destroyed. Who will be held responsible for that? If they point the fingers at Putin, he's the wrong man. He didn't want to do it. He was the reluctant fighter in this whole mess. He held off for years. He begged us to listen. You can go back all the way back to George Kennan, who pointed these things out, and right up to Ambassador Burns, who is now the director of the CIA, who wrote the famous memo, "Niet means no. Don't advance the borders of NATO to Russia." All of this is well known.
Colonel, no one is explaining these things as you are, and certainly no one knows tanks the way you do. And thank you for the education and the passion with which you have offered it, that you've explained to all of us. Always a pleasure, my dear friend.